I've seen a ton of ads lately for the book Ultra Processed People, which I originally thought was all about people who are really good at managing processes and life admin. Turns out I was wrong. And I'm joined by two very clever people to tell me just how wrong I was. We are going to be diving in fork first to the world of ultra processed foods. From the snacks we crave, the meals we microwave, and the label ingredients that sound like science experiments. We interviewed over 12,000 people all about ultra processed foods, and we're going to be chewing on their truths. Did I squeeze in too many puns, or was that just enough? We're joined by our regular co-host Chris Beer, and obviously our new addition to the pod, Stephanie Harlow. Steph is an expert on all things food, and we'll come to that in a minute. But you also are one of our head researchers on our monthly Zeitgeist surveys, aren't you?
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how you became the expert on food, which sounds like a bizarre question, like who doesn't love food? But talk me through your passion there.
Well, for starters, I love food. Big fan of cooking, always been very interested in food. But other than that, I'm also really interested in gut health. So there's been so much research over the last few years about how important gut health is, and the connection between the gut and the brain. So I generally try and keep abreast of any research about the gut in general and gut health.
Yeah, nice. Everyone's talking about the gut lately. That's
yes.
a real big thing on TikTok. So explain it to me like I'm 5, because I may or may not know what ultra processed foods are. When I was younger, it was very much about like the E numbers. Like there was so much scaremongering about, the blue food coloring is like the worst for you, and E numbers of like this E number will give you headaches and this E number will, give you a sore tummy. So tell me what ultra processed food is. Like what's the actual definition?
Yeah, so Chris Van Tulleken, who is an infectious diseases doctor, and also wrote Ultra Processed People, which we'll be discussing, and was also involved with the BBC documentary, which really kind of brought this to the fore. So he would describe UPF as something that is wrapped in plastic and it contains ingredients that you can't find in your kitchen. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty accessible in terms of the definition.
Right. So basically an ingredient that we can't pronounce.
Basically. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just that you couldn't find yourself.
Yes. Yeah. So another thing that it can be is also if there are health claims on food. So something like chicken or orange, it doesn't need a health claim because people know what it is. So that can be another thing that kind of trips people up because it says it's, got added vitamin C. But the thing about UPF is that it is prioritizing profits over nutritional benefits. So they need to sell these things to people. So something like that is more likely to sort of say that a food is ultra processed.
Sorry, just to be clear, so if something has added vitamin C, it's more likely to be ultra processed?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So this is, because this is, I understand it, this is the key point, isn't it, but this is what makes it new, is that I feel like certainly what I remember from food and how I saw about when I was younger is, you look at the food itself or the nutrients it contains, whereas it's more about the processing, what happens to it in the factory, if you like, or in the lab. So you might have something that's marketed as a low fat or low sugar option, which I've become accustomed to thinking, that's the healthy one. But this lens, that might not indicate it's healthy.
Yeah, no, exactly that. I mean, it's trying to sell things to people rather than give them any nutritional value, and therefore, those claims just make it far more likely to be UPF.
Yeah, I think, I'm fascinated by food marketing as well, because I think you often go into the supermarket or anywhere with the best of intentions, and then what you put in your basket, your trolley, ends up being quite different. I mean, I had this experience earlier this week. I got back home quite late from a flight, and the only place that was open near me where I could get food, I mean, I won't name what it was, but Steph, I think you would have been very disappointed by what I ended up eating. But it was like in that moment, like I'm being driven by my gut. You talk about the gut-brain connection. I was like, I need something in me right now. I don't care how processed it is, and all the ideas of what I should or should not eat went out of the window. That's why I find it so interesting of how to balance those different ideas and those different needs.
It's like going food shopping when you're hungry, like the stuff that you put in your cart versus if you just have a snack. It's a completely different basket.
Exactly. I mean, and these kinds of foods are generally the ones that are quick, easy, you know, they definitely fill a hole if you're starving and you just got back really late. So I think it can be really difficult for people because a lot of the time they're also really cheap as well.
Yeah. I think it's interesting you mentioned about studying this stuff and trying to see the benefit of them, because I mean, understanding food habits, I understand, is just quite difficult to research generally. I mean, you know better than anyone else, you manage our monthly Zeitgeist surveys. People don't always tell the truth in a survey. You know, sometimes you have to look at it with a slightly critical lens. Like, you know, doctors will know as well what people say about how much they drink and smoke. Probably not reflective of reality.
Yes, no, that is very true. It's
just hard to set up these controlled environments where you can gauge exactly what people are eating and what the effect is. But as I understand it, I mean, you know probably the research a bit better than me, Steph, there was a study in 2019, I want to say, where it was kind of gold standard, randomized controlled trial where they had one group of people who were eating the equivalent of UPF foods, but everything was balanced out. So I can't remember exactly how they did it, but like portion size, that kind of thing. And by the end of this experiment, 2 weeks or whatever it was, there was some suggestion that the people who were on a more UPF diet were gaining more calories, gaining more weight. So from that, there is some sense of like, yes, this stuff might be having an impact, but it might not be clear if it's because of those intrinsic properties or they're just so delicious you just can't stop eating them.
Yeah. That was going to be my question. Like, are they actually innately more calorific, or are they just moreish? Like when you're sat eating a packet of crisps, you don't have the intention to eat the entire packet of crisps, but every time you swallow one, you just automatically reach for another until it's the end of the packet and you wish that you had savored the final crisp a bit more. Chris, my question for you is, are people actually worried about this? And if so, how? And if so, who? Like, is it a middle class fad diet thing that everyone's like, avoid ultra processed foods, or like, what's the story there?
Yeah, so we researched this in January, I want to say. We did the
yes, I think it was early this year.
CPF, which is quite interesting time to interview people about their food habits, really. I think
true
when they're making new starts, you know, what's the kind of data you might get back. But no, I had the same thought as you, Jenna. My initial assumption was, you know, some food trends, they seem to be a kind of product of the worried well. It's like, maybe if you've got money to spend, you can buy something that's maybe marked up as a premium. It happens to be whatever, you know, diet or whatever is in at the moment. And the results showed that concern was a lot more universal than I realized. I think it was about 3/4 who very concerned. Can't remember exactly how he defined
about
it.
ultra processed foods.
Wow. And that's pretty big. Like for context, like surveys we've done, when you ask about concern about anything, like that's a really high number. But the benefit we can do with our data platform is we can put the audience on the microscope and think, okay, concern is pretty much universal. Who's most concerned, or which groups support the highest level of concern? And that is actually where you do see a bit more of that middle class audience come out. I mean, we were talking about this off air. So to give some sort of key indicators of the audience, they're more likely to be female, 65 plus, have a high level of income, have a post-grad degree, kind of live in around London. You know, I think you sort of the details are colouring in as I describe it, I think. And then their lifestyles probably what you'd expect. So they seem to be quite interested in clean living in general. So they're often vegetarian, care about animal welfare, those kind of topics, care about the environment, you know, play tennis, go to the gym, even at that advanced stage. I mean, there's a phrase you used for it, Steph. I think it was like something about purity in mind, body and soul, I think, that summarized it quite well.
Going for that whole holistic health.
Yeah, it just seems to be part of that. And also plugged into the art scene, you know, going to museums and galleries, there's quite an overlap there. And we were trying to think of a celebrity who might represent these kind of characteristics to help call it in for people. And we were chucking out names like, I think Joanna Lumley, Emma Thompson, Caroline Lucas, maybe, the Green MPs, maybe examples of that. But I mean, my mum was also one that came to mind. As I was going through, I was thinking, those things do describe her quite well.
Definitely.
Is this why you do a big reveal and tell us that your mum is Joanna Lumley?
Well, you know, we're still waiting back for the DNA results on that one. So maybe that's one for the next episode. But there was another audience that they were really concerned about UPFs. That it did kind of tickle me, but I thought, oh, maybe there's something deeper in that. And that's people who've literally just bought a microwave in the last 3 to 6 months. Yeah. And we were talking about this off air, and initially I thought, oh, that's just kind of a funny thing. But then I thought, maybe there is something in there. I don't know.
Yeah, what is that?
Well, I thought it could be something to do with if you have just bought a microwave planning on eating more microwavable meals, you might be a bit concerned
Worried,
because you think actually maybe this is something I want to cut back on.
Yeah.
But it does feel a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? Because
Yeah.
microwave meals are probably quite high in.
Yeah.
ultra-processed
On the
foods.
whole, I imagine most of them would be.
Yeah, fair enough. Talking more about the fad diets, because I know that, you know, there's always like a new fad diet that everyone's following, and I feel like food is so very much under the microscope, especially with social media. Like, I know it doesn't count as a diet, but back in the day when girl dinner was like the new thing that everyone was talking about, and then back in like the 2010s it was veganism, and that was like the big thing that everyone was pushing for, and there was so many lifestyle influencers that were really very much tying into what you were saying of like the holistic mind body. They would be, you know, making their acai bowls of smoothie and also doing yoga and then meditating and, you know, saying good vibes only. Like, it was a real vibe, you know, whereas the ultra processed thing is less of a vibe. do you know what I mean? It has less of a kind of sweeping movement towards it. It's less of a lifestyle thing, or at least it feels less of a lifestyle thing. So I don't know if you have anything else on the fad versus kind of existing.
I mean, I suppose I feel like this is kind of part of a bigger thing that I'm noticing in our data. I think if you throw things back, you know, quite a while ago, maybe 15 years ago, I feel like dieting a lot of the time was about how you look. But I feel like over time it's become less about how you look and more about how you feel. You know, a lot more people in our data are saying that they have gut issues. A lot more people are dieting not to lose weight, but to control other things like blood sugar levels and things like that. And I feel like this is sort of coming out of that. It's a bit of a change on how people actually look at food, I think.
No, I agree with you, Jenna. I think you've identified something. It's quite hard to articulate, but I do know what you mean. And just based on the levels we saw in the polling, like, this is just a bigger thing than, you know, maybe among a small, more trendy group in society. And the US is quite an interesting context here. I mean, we've talked mostly about the UK so far, just because it's our home market. But of course, there it's a real thing, and it's become quite a political issue because, of course, now RFK Jr. is the health secretary. I can't remember the job title exactly. And it's interesting, a lot of the research coming out of focus groups over there, people will say things like, you know, might not agree with his views on vaccines, but he's sort of known as a sort of champion of being like, well, you know, what is the food industry putting into these products? Like, this is something we need to look at because we have these very, very poor health outcomes. And it seems to be something that's more distributed among different parts of society than just the kind of, you know, trend cycle magazine readers type audience.
Yeah, definitely. It's fascinating to see how, like, the political landscape has a direct kind of transference of ideology. And as you were speaking, I thought of something else that we talked about in a previous podcast episode about government trust. And I wonder if it ties into like trust of systems, like or big pharma, and kind of the, you know, how much do I trust what these big corporations are doing? And I think that is a fear for a lot of people right now. Whether it's right or wrong, you know, it's kind of by the by. Yeah,
we used that as one of the trends in a trend report of ours a few years ago, didn't we? I think it was falling trust in institutions. And I think it's surprising how often it comes back again and again in different forms. The idea of people feeling a bit more abstracted from power systems, whether it's in the food you eat or other things.
That's really interesting. So at the start, I made it abundantly clear that I didn't actually know what ultra processed food was. I'm interested to know if I represent the average consumer. Hopefully I do, so then I feel better about myself. But how confident are they at identifying what ultra processed foods are?
So they're actually pretty confident.
Okay, great. That makes me feel great.
Yeah, sorry about that. So 62% of consumers say that they understand the term ultra processed foods.
Okay.
But if we unpack that a little bit more, they're pretty good on the whole at identifying what foods are ultra processed. But there are some things that can catch people out. So around 60% are able to correctly identify things like ready meals and tinned soup that on the whole are UPF. But in terms of things that catch people out, so breakfast cereals is one. So around 40% think that it's UPF.
Surely it is.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Chris Van Tulleken would say
Yay.
that the majority of cereals that you could buy in the shops would be UPF.
Yeah.
And I think that one catches people out a little bit because some are incredibly obvious. You got those very high sugary cereals that, you can imagine would be ultra processed.
Cartoon mascots, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, like where does that grow on the tree?
Exactly. But there are a lot more that I think are probably a bit harder for people to identify. So kind of going back to your point about clean living, granola and things like that have become really popular. I think people might initially think that's a healthier option, but it doesn't stop it also being, packed with those kinds of ingredients.
Yeah.
And then infant formula is actually another one. So only 17% of consumers think that it's UPF. But this one is actually quite a tricky one. It's quite a dangerous one because even though it would count as UPF, it's obviously a life-saving formula and it's actually used by most UK families in their infant's first year.
Yeah.
So that is just something that you kind of need to be careful about.
Yeah. And it's like, even if it's not like a life-saving opportunity, it's like for women who just don't want to breastfeed. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
It's like a given. Fantastic, you've got that choice.
Yeah.
So I guess there's a caveat there around like just because it's ultra processed, it doesn't automatically mean it's bad or wrong.
Yeah.
Like it's full of nutrition and is, as you say, like crucially important.
Yeah.
I think you probably touch a bit more on this as you talk about the research, but that's one of the interesting things, isn't it? It's about how people understand ultra processed often overlaps with like foods that are considered good or bad for some reasons. I think it's sort of food types they can think of, but just to stay on the point of infant formula for a while, it's interesting because just after we did this research, I went to a friend of mine's christening for his young son. And obviously the kind of event it's at, you can imagine there's lots of parents, lots of little kids running around, people just talking about childcare and kids a lot more.
Baby stuff.
And one of my friends mentioned that his wife had been on a real UPF kick recently, being a lot more critical about looking at labels and, putting different things in the basket so that they'd be UPF free. And her husband had to make the point, well, infant formula is technically UPF, and he wasn't doing it in a mean-spirited way or anything. I think he was more pointing out the information. But again, it kind of brings that thing of like, okay, well, in certain instances, certain cases, it's going to be useful. So it's interesting, isn't it, about how you tease that apart from maybe a kind of more, I don't know, moral narrative around it.
Yeah. There's definitely things like that to be aware of. A lot of people, they can't breastfeed. So,
yeah. And food preservatives as well, making food last longer on the shelf is maybe something we've got used to. And there's an element of like, we take those things out, is that going to have knock-on effects down the line? Yeah,
and while you're talking about preservatives, actually, canned veg, canned or tinned vegetables, that's another thing that also trips people up. Almost 30% of consumers think that is UPF, but it's not. And I'm guessing I'm guessing that people think that it is, maybe because it's in a can.
I think packaging will definitely play a role. I remember in back in COVID, which is now 5 years ago, which is absolutely terrifying. I remember obviously there was nothing on the shelves and everyone was panic buying, and I went to the Aldi near me and walked in to see empty shelves, and I was like, I feel like I just need to buy something. I feel like I just need to have food in my house. And the only thing left, it was like, I remember it was so dystopian, like a complete empty shelf and just one can of tinned peaches. And I was like, that'll do. That's what my emergency supply will be, these tinned peaches. And I had never, speaking from such a position of privilege, I've never felt the need to buy tinned veg. I've always bought fresh veg, mainly because I can afford to buy fresh veg, but also it feels more fresh and I feel like it would be better for me. And I don't know where that rhetoric has come from, because I obviously clearly am wrong about the fact that, it's ultra processed. But it's just interesting, isn't it? Because I to this day, I haven't eaten those tinned peaches because I don't want to. And I never had to, thankfully. We didn't go into a dystopian kind of zombie apocalypse where I had to eat them. But, it's a really interesting misconception.
And the other thing that comes to mind when you're describing it is something, I think an example that's often used that happen in reverse is sliced white bread, which can have UPF in it. But of course, you go into the shop and it's done up like a fresh bakery, and like you get that smell of bread, and it's like it feels fresher than it might be. So I'd be interested to explain exactly the distinctions of processed versus ultra processed.
Yeah. So so I think why tinned vegetables actually trips people up because they do have preservatives in them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's ultra processed. So at the very bottom, you've got your core foods, or whole foods rather. So that's things like eggs, a chicken breast and things like that. Then you've got processed foods, so that's things like ham, bacon. It's gone through a process, things like pasta that it didn't arrive in that form, but it doesn't have those UPF ingredients in them. And then at the very top, you've got ultra processed foods, and these are, like we've said in the earlier on, they're things that are prioritizing profit over nutrition. They don't actually have very much nutritional value.
So you could check the ingredients list for canned peas, something, it would just say peas and water.
Yes, yeah. I mean, some of them have got a preservative in them, but that preservative doesn't actually count as UPF.
Yeah. Bread's a really interesting one. So I can't remember what it was, so I'm not going to try and remember, but I was watching a documentary at some point in my life on some channel, very ambiguous, and it was all about like the world's healthiest communities, and it was going around like to all these different villages, and there was this one village in Italy, and they were trying to figure out like what makes this village so healthy, why is their kind of life expectancy so long, and they were eating a ton of bread, and I was like, hang on, I thought bread was meant to be bad for you. And they basically found out that it was a specific kind of bread, which was sourdough, which takes a lot of time to bake, and it's kind of fermented maybe, and kind of has good it's good for your gut. It's got what's the word, oh my god, what's the word,
yeast,
probiotics and stuff. Yeast, basically good bacteria, because of the way it's made. And so ever since then I've started buying, instead of like a loaf, because I'm like, I'm being so healthy, I'm eating sourdough bread.
yeah
But like you say, it is kind of banded up to be, oh, it's your local bakery, and it's actually not. It's just it's factory made loaves.
Yeah, completely. I mean, a lot of bread that you buy in the supermarket would be UPF. But that's also where like the time and also the money issue do come in.
100%, because sourdough takes way longer to make.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I make it, but
you make your own sourdough.
I do, but I also work from home a lot of the time, so I do have the time to make my own sourdough.
I'm not sure we've ever seen the sourdough in the office.
I think we need to start bringing this in.
Bring it in,
please.
But a lot of people, that's just not obtainable. It's just not doable.
Yeah, it's like that audience we were describing earlier. They're probably the ones with time on their hands. They might not necessarily be working full time anymore because they're a bit older, but they've got money, resources, and they've probably got a big kitchen that you can need all sorts of equipment you need to make that.
I want to ask about where this has come from all of a sudden. So as I was saying, like with fad diets, they kind of seem to just emerge out of nowhere. Like you see one or two influencers doing it and then everyone's doing it. Veganism felt a lot like that. There was like the Deliciously Ella kind of cult following, followed by Asina O'Neill on Instagram. And what's interesting is that some of the influencers that I used to follow that were vegan are now on the carnivore diet. So fascinating.
It's a bit of a 180.
I know. But I think what it just goes to show is any of these bad diets are just a pendulum of extremes. It's not actually the diet itself that certain people are attracted to. It's the extremeness and the kind of restrictiveness of it. And, anyway, I digress. I want to know kind of where this has come from. Has it just come out of the blue? Or why are people talking about it all of a sudden? We mentioned the book. Maybe that's part of it.
Yeah. So certainly if you look at Google Trends, then the big spikes in people searching for ultra processed food comes off the back of the book being published and the documentary. But the story of where it gets to Chris Van Tulloken is quite interesting. So it originally comes out of Brazil, and the term ultra processed food is either invented or popularized by a scientist, nutritionist called Carlos Monteiro. And the story about it is worth telling. So he did a lot of work in the 1990s and 2000s. Which indicated that obesity was a growing problem in Brazil. And we kind of hear that and we're like, countries, as they get richer, they get more obese. We're sort of used to it as a public health issue, but the context at the time was very interesting. I think the Brazilian government at the time, their main focus in terms of public health was alleviating hunger. And, you know, in that stage, still relatively a developing economy, they assumed that would be the focus. And this guy went out and said, actually, maybe the thing we need to focus on is that more of our people are getting fat and we need to look at the causes. And he did subsequent research and published a paper in 2009 where we're talking about the definition of this stuff. And looking at it now, it's so revealing. I think the name of the paper is "The Issue is Not Food nor Nutritions." I'll start again. The name of the paper is "The Issue is Not Food nor Nutrients so much as Processing," which is, you know, it's exactly as you're describing it earlier. So you're not looking at foods and the amount of fat or sugar content they have, but the amount of processing that they've received. Then I think after that, subsequent studies in the 2010s that indicate, oh, maybe there's a connection between this and a certain outcome. As mentioned earlier, it's really hard to test and fully prove. Then there's that study in 2019, which seemed to be the clear signal of like, oh, there might be something in this. So it is interesting that it seems to have, as well as the cultural stuff, people observing it, there is this, I guess, scientific pedigree or body research behind it.
Yeah.
And then we get to the cultural crossover moment, I guess, which is it's just interesting to talk about as an example of how trends happen, right? Yeah. Just how these things emerge and what helps popularize them. Yeah,
completely. I mean, and like Chris Van Tulleken, who wrote the book, has also been on so many podcasts and things like that. And, you know, a podcast, obviously a really hot way that people find out more information. You know, health in particular is a massive topic when it comes to podcast listening and tuning in. So I think that's got to, you know, contribute to it. I think sort of as I said a little bit earlier, I do believe that this trend has been born out of people becoming more interested in eating to feel a certain way, not just about looking a certain way. And I think it is also kind of connected to the veganism trend a little bit because, you know, the decline in veganism is something that we've covered quite a lot in our data and looked at, you know, in our big Connecting the Dots report and things like that. And I think that, you know, part of that could actually be people turning away from veganism because quite a lot of vegan food is actually ultra processed. You know, someone might think that eating, you know, a salmon fillet is actually the lesser of two evils compared to, you know, a vegan product that is UPF.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So Steph, what would you say, kind of looking forward, what's the future of this? Do you think it will continue to climb or...
So I think that now this information is out there, we're likely to see an impact, but it's just hard to say how much of an impact. So Chris and I were talking about this when we were doing the research for it. So we decided to have a look at the impact of like the sugar tax, for example. So we had a look at, you know, what people were drinking before it came in compared to after. It didn't actually impact how many people were still consuming things like Pepsi and Coca-Cola, but there was a 15% increase in the number that were drinking Coke Zero. So we might see something in our data. And I think the kind of consumer that is very concerned about this, that Chris mentioned at the start, you know, they're likely to continue making more conscious decisions. But, you know, like I said, I think that this is probably part of like a bigger trend. So it's really hard to see how much you were going to notice this in our data.
Yeah. Just to explain, so the sugar tax legislation that's brought in, I think in the 2010s, that meant so soft drink manufacturers basically had a choice of they either reformulate their products to have less sugar, so they don't have to pay this tax and therefore charge a higher price, or continue with the products as before, but then they effectively have to pass on that cost to the consumer. And there was different approaches that different ones took. So we thought that might be an interesting case study of, well, if there's more concern about UPF that goes into legislation, maybe it's a good analogy to think what might happen. So it's interesting that, like the alternatives increase, but the kind of baseline doesn't decrease. It becomes more of an and rather than a replacement.
Pulling it back to brands, what can we learn about this? Like, is there a kind of key takeaway that we want to help brands out with their kind of product development strategies or kind of any key takeaways?
So something I think we could start seeing is products that are more whole food driven. So I don't know if you've heard of or seen Simmer. They are
I have, on TikTok.
Okay. Yeah.
Seen so many of the ads.
My friend showed me she actually got one of the meals.
Yeah.
I had a look at the ingredients and I couldn't see any UPF on there. It looked like it was just very simple ingredients. So we might start seeing more things going towards that, whether it's in supermarkets or if it's a subscription model.
So is this a monthly subscription thing?
I believe it's a subscription, yeah.
So it's still satisfying the convenience need.
Yes.
Big time.
Yeah.
But it's like ready-made meals that are delivered to your door, and I think you just oven them or microwave them or whatever. But apparently their burrito one is like incredible.
Oh, really?
So really tasty.
I will bear that.
But the idea and the whole vibe of the brand is that it's home cooked.
Yeah.
It feels kind of like a family meal. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I can see that in the ingredients list as well. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if also you've seen that Marks and Spencer's have also made like a bit of a move, and they've launched this just ingredients range so like the cornflakes that are in that range only have one ingredient in them.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's definitely satisfying that consumer that is trying to cut back on UPF.
Yeah.
And it'd be interesting to see if we see other brands kind of make a move in that direction. You know, how well that range will do. Be really interesting to see.
Yeah, it's because you showed me an example, they've almost put they've made the small print large print in a way, so the ingredients are now on the front, and it's literally just like, oh, cornflakes are just cornflakes. It's interesting how they flip the script on that. And M&S, I feel it might be on something, because my sense is, my gut tells me, no pun intended, they've got a good tracker with this, because a few years ago when we were starting to see those trends in our data around gut health, people becoming more conscious of it, they went quite early with the gut shot products. They've done collaboration with Zoe, the health app, so they seem to have their finger on the pulse of this.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting collaboration with Zoe. Good move.
Yeah, we talked about Brazil earlier, where the research terminology for this stuff comes from, and they might offer some useful lessons and clues as to what comes next, because they may be a bit more ahead of the curve, the trend cycle with labeling and what they put on their packaging. So, we have a traffic light system in the UK around fats, sugars and salt, and they have something similar, but with ultra processed foods.
Oh, nice.
And the warnings are a bit more stark, I would say. So I think they, on a packaging for, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but there would just be like an octagonal label on it that says, this contains ultra processed foods. There's no color grading. It's kind of like it does or it doesn't.
Just a warning label.
Yeah, I think exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Hazard.
So, that which we're sort of more used to from tobacco and alcohol, right? So I think it's in Chile where that's introduced, and I think other Latin American countries have similar things. So it's so tricky, because I think the future of this trend won't necessarily just be guided by consumer preference. It will be what governments decide to do, and that's largely knowable. So at this stage, you've almost got to plot out different scenarios of what might happen, like assume no change. If this kind of legislation is brought in, what might happen next?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's so tricky to know, because I read a research paper that said that the traffic light system in the UK hasn't been massively effective. But if that was coupled with a very strong warning, maybe we would see more of an impact.
I'm thinking the examples you mentioned earlier. I suppose like the big thing I found looking at the data is like if my brand was making a lot of canned or tinned veg, I would think, oh, I've got to kind of overcorrect, if you like, or like make it sort of like, you wouldn't sound so desperate obviously, but like make it clear that like, no, this is not ultra processed, like don't sort of bracket us with this other stuff, because just through the packaging and in infant formula as well, like that might become a tricky situation. There might have to be a sort of educational piece of like, well, yes, technically it's defined a UPF, but it's all these other things as well. And it doesn't, the baby isn't thrown out with the bathwater, so to speak.
No, definitely. I mean, I think it would be a great outcome if, there could be more knowledge around things like tinned veg, because it's actually a cheap way of, cutting back on UPF is using those kinds of ingredients. Yeah.
So it's, I mean, if I had all the time in the world, I'd sort of go in our data and maybe look, history of Brazil, like when did they introduce legislation? Was there anything that happens to snack food purchases there? I mean, that would be something to look at if I had more time.
Nice. Should we move over to our local lowdown?
Yes,
segment?
yeah. So it's a quick one today, but it's very relevant because it's the country that we've just been discussing about, Brazil. We know the science came from it, and it's interesting to think why it might have come from there based on other factors we see. So Brazilians stand out on the global stage for a number of things related to personal health and body image. Interesting, you said earlier, we don't necessarily think about diet in terms of what we might look like, but Brazil, that's probably a bit different. So they're among world leaders for using health and fitness apps, online fitness classes, being interested in beauty, working in health and beauty, buying deodorant, using Pinterest, and getting plastic surgery.
Oh, wow.
And in many cases in Brazil, the government actually subsidizes plastic surgery because the model there is, well, if you don't have access to it, it might cause psychological harm.
Wow.
If you don't have access to improved appearance. It's a really interesting thing. And of course, there are cosmetic treatments that are named from Brazil, of course.
Brazilian butt lift
Yeah.
and even Brazilian waxing.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a
that's
thing
true.
too.
It's all for good reason. But then relevant to what we talked about today, they're also world leaders for buying health foods and organic fruit and vegetables. Interesting to consider if it's related to what's happened in the last 10 years or so.
That's so interesting.
And the funny thing is this does seem to go quite deep in Brazilian culture. So like the first written records you have in the country is Portuguese sailors who landed and explored there. And they just keep going on about how beautiful the native population are. They're like, these people are walking around without many clothes. They're the most beautiful people I've ever seen. And if you look at Brazilian culture, Brazilian music, the idea of admiring beautiful people is something that sticks around, to say the least. And of course, Brazil's got its long sandy beaches. The sun's out a lot of the time. Like your body is probably on public display quite a lot of the time if you live in Rio, for example. But I enjoy those insights about Brazil because they force me to think differently. I think you were saying earlier, we're perhaps used to a certain cultural narrative in the UK and probably the US as well around how body image has changed and people eating, not necessarily to look like a certain way, but in Brazil it is quite different. And their conception about body image is more about optimization. And it's still, we're talking to a Brazilian colleague of ours in the office, like it's still more linked to social mobility. Like, if you look beautiful, if you look attractive, it helps you get a partner, like it helps you get the right job. Like there's still a social
That's
context
so
around it.
interesting.
But I find it such an interesting example because it shows you how data can escape your cultural context a little bit and stop you just putting the same lens on everywhere.
Love it.
Yeah, completely.
Steph, thank you so much for having us. Man, I need to have lunch. I need some ultra processed lunch in me. Steph, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you at home for watching. If you like what you saw, please like and subscribe and click the bell to get notified when we next have an episode out. You can also subscribe to The Real Deal, which is the On the Dot newsletter at gwi.com. Every Wednesday, you'll receive a ton of insights all about pop culture trends and what's going down in Consumer Town. Thanks so much. See you soon.